Hello. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Apoorv, CEO of Stella, and today I'm going to be talking about unlocking next DeFi growth through leverage. So before I start, just a quick primer on who we are, what we do, and what is our background. So we've been building in DeFi since 2020. We were initially called Alpha Homora. We were the first leverage yield farming protocol on Ethereum. We launched in 2020 before DeFi summer. Went to an all-time high TVL of around 2 billion and went on to raise from Binance Labs, Multicoin, Spartan, and a bunch of crypto-native VCs. In the bear market, the yield farming landscape sort of changed a lot, so we pivoted to something called a Stella, which is, again, leverage with 0% cost to borrow. And finally, we are working on a new form of a leverage, which I'll talk about towards the end. But all in all, we are degenerates, we love leverage, we love aping in, and that's what we are building in. Cool, so today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of leverage in DeFi. So 15 minutes of your attention, and I'll walk you through of how DeFi has essentially evolved, how leverage in DeFi specifically has evolved, and how we are trying to play along the narrative for it, right? Cool, so let's start with leverage 1.0, like the very basic primitive of how leverage in DeFi started. And it started with money markets, essentially lending, borrowing protocols, right? So the very first form of leverage was like looping on money markets, right? You can deposit an asset, borrow more of another asset, swap it back into the original asset, again deposit it, and sort of loop it to create that leveraged position, right? Aave, Compound were the sort of protocols where you started doing it. Then came the more innovative, newer sort of protocols called Euler and Beta Finance, which essentially allowed you to borrow longer tail assets. So you can borrow long tail assets, short them, long them. So like it sort of increased the spectrum of assets you could take leverage on. And then there were DApps built on top of it, right? There was InstaDApp, there was DeFi Saver, a lot of cool, innovative DApps that allowed easy leverage on the foundation of these borrowing protocols. So while this DeFi primitive was super crucial in kickstarting leverage, there were a lot of limitations with it, right? Like essentially leverage was capped by LTV, which is loan to value ratio. There was borrow caps and all of that. You could only take up to a certain amount of leverage, which is when sort of Alpha Homora came into the picture, and we sort of brought in what is called as leverage 2.0 or composable leverage, right? The idea was very similar. There was a yield source that you wanted to leverage on top of. There were lending pools where you essentially draw liquidity from to create a leveraged position. And then there was the core Alpha Homora protocol itself, right? So I'll walk you through on how the mechanism essentially worked. So a user came in, he deposited some amount of collateral into the leverage protocol. He would borrow from the lending pool, create a leveraged position, and then deposit it into the yield source, right? And the LP tokens from the yield source would be brought back into the smart contracts of our leverage protocol. So essentially, while the user was withdrawing an under-collateralized loan, we held the LP tokens in our smart contract, and the system as a whole was always over-collateralized, right? And this was sort of like a landmark moment because this enabled, in some way, under-collateralized lending. And like really kickstarted the DeFi summer with like 4-digit APYs, and that's where like all the TVL came from initially, right? So this sort of helped us to get like 2 billion in TVL. It was amazing. They were the golden DeFi summer days of 4-digit APYs. But obviously like the landscape has changed a lot, right? And there are problems with this model. The main problem is that when you're sort of, say you're earning Y% APY from the yield source, and you're paying an X% APY in the lending pool for borrowing. So a lot of times, the borrow cost, the borrow APY became more than the lending APY, right? So the user got wrecked, essentially. The math just didn't make sense. And second problem was that nobody really wants to lend, right? Everybody just wants to borrow and farm, right? So there was always a mismatch in this equation, where there were more number of borrowers and less number of lenders. Cool. So to sort of counteract this and to improve on this model, we introduced Stella, which was leverage 2.5, right? And we thought that, hey, we will allow the leverager or the borrower to borrow at 0% cost, right? There is no upfront borrow APY. They just borrow, they farm their position, once they close their position, they share a portion of the profits with the with lender, right? And we thought that, okay, this makes sense because now the sort of lending APY, the farming APY is always more than the borrowing APY, and the incentives are sort of aligned, right? The lender also wants the borrower to make money so that they get a bigger profit cut from it. So this sort of a model by Stella helped us solve the problem, for the first problem, where like the farming APY was always more than the borrowing APY. So one problem was solved, but the second problem still persisted, right? Still, nobody wanted to lend, everybody just wanted to borrow, right? And that is the problem that most sort of leverage protocols in DeFi are facing right now. That is why margin trading hasn't really like taken off so much as say perps have taken off. Because essentially, on-chain liquidity is really hard to scale. And because of that, leverage using on-chain liquidity is really hard to scale. So what does leverage look like? You know, there are so many problems. We have tweaked with the models of leverage, but still we are not able to scale after a certain point. So this is our thesis of like how leverage will look like in this cycle, right? And the first point is, in my opinion, for leverage to really scale, it has to be synthetic, right? For us to reach like TradFi levels of leverage, we need to bring in synthetic, that is P2P leverage, and the liquidity needs to be just in time. What that basically means is you cannot like have an AMM sort of a pool where there's like a lot of liquidity sitting and people like just sitting idle. To sort of keep that liquidity intact, you'll have to give out a lot of emissions, which is not capital efficient, right? So the most efficient way to like have leverage is with just-in-time liquidity, not like the AMM models or even like the order book model where like there's liquidity fragmentation across chains. So that's our thesis point number one. The second point is we just have to go where the liquidity is, right? Despite like hundreds and thousands of perp dexes out there today, still 95% of perp trading volume still sits on centralized exchanges. So essentially, to tap into that liquidity, we'll need to tap into liquidity of centralized exchanges and liquidity on dexes across chains, right? And while we want to do that, we want to still enable that in a trustless, permissionless manner. So that's what we are working on. We call it Leverage 3.0, and we'll be launching that in the next couple of months. The idea is very simple. We allow the user to leverage on absolutely anything which has a reliable data feed, right? Like even if the asset is synthetic, it's points, it's meme coins, you name it, right? Meme coins is the more important thing these days than trading BTC ETH. But essentially, you get leverage on anything with a data feed, even the weather, a political election, anything, right? The second is we'll be moving towards the new buzzword called intent. So we'll be using intent-based architecture. And that is what will essentially enable us, allow us to use like liquidity from centralized exchanges, liquidity from across perp dexes, and essentially all resources. And third and the final point is we want to access universal liquidity, right? We are not trying to build like an app chain with bootstrap liquidity from the ground up. We are trying to vampire attack centralized exchanges or perp dexes which already have that liquidity sitting on them and trying to use that liquidity to fulfill orders on chain. Yeah, so I think that's the sort of vision. In some sense, we are trying to be like the citadel for DeFi, like in a permissionless, decentralized way. And what that basically means is, if you look at TradFi, right, there are like these popular apps called Robinhood where users can trade. But they are essentially like a front end for a lot of market making and trading services like Citadel, you know. So essentially, these are the ones which provide the order fulfillment, and they settle on the on underlying exchanges like New York Stock Exchange. We are trying to do something very similar in the DeFi sense, where we are not trying to build a new DApp. We are trying to build like the infrastructure for intent-based derivatives, right? So essentially, anybody can come and build a DApp on top of us with their own front end, with their own token, their own branding, their own UX, their own chain. We are chain agnostic. But essentially, our infrastructure will allow them to like take leverage position on any asset, right? And the cool thing is, like Citadel sort of settles on New York Stock Exchange, our infrastructure will allow them to settle on any centralized exchange, any DEX out there, right? So in some sense, it allows you like a unified trading account that can allow the user to trade on any SEX, any DEX, without even knowing, with that entire process being abstracted on where the order fulfillment is actually happening. So that's about it. Thank you so much for listening. I know it's been like a rough week for all of us. But here's my Telegram. If there's anybody interested in DeFi, user, investor, market maker, anything, feel free to reach out. I'll be more than happy to chat. Thank you for your time.